afternoon, everyone. Really? Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Philbrick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Minetta Transportation Institute. I have the pleasure of knowing many of you, but for those who I don't, the Minetta Transportation Institute is actually a university transportation center housed right here at San Jose State University within the College of Business. We are competitively selected by the U.S. Department of Transportation. We focus on improving the mobility of people and goods. And we do this all through surface transportation research, technology transfer, workforce development, and education. Now, how many of you in this room have heard about MTI previously? Excellent. So, for those who have heard about us, this will be a little bit of a repeat, and for our new friends, I encourage you to get involved in our many activities and research projects. So, in addition to our general research portfolio, which we currently have 126 projects that are in process, ranging from everything looking at autonomous vehicle disengagements to emergency management preparedness and cybersecurity, we have a robust portfolio of information available on our website, not only to help people who are practitioners or scholars, but for people who are leading our transit agencies and other research portfolios. And to that end, I would like to acknowledge Mr. Michael Hirsh, CEO of AC Transit. Thank you for joining us today. And also Kip Harkness, Assistant City Manager for the City of San Jose. We appreciate all of you being here, and especially you two, as we know that this is a critically important topic and that you're very, very busy. Now, with our education program, we have a Master's of Science in Transportation Management. Dr. Edwards and Mr. Goodrich are two of our faculty members. It's designed for the working professional so that they can obtain their master's degrees through evening classes so that they can take that next step in their career path. But we also know that not everybody is going to be in a master's program. We also know that we have frontline positions within the transportation industry that will need to be filled. In fact, today, as I stand before you, about 53% of the nation's transportation workforce is eligible for retirement. This means, imagine half of you standing up and walking out of this room. That could happen. So as with other industries, we're competing for new talent and to get people interested in this exciting field. So to that end, we have K-12 workforce development programs. We actually go in with first and second graders and we teach them about grade crossing safety, about the use of bus and light rail safety, and just get them interested in the topic in general. Because what we have found is, if you ask the general person, they're not able to mention a career in transportation beyond bus driver, airline pilot, or maybe ship captain. But we know that we have, well, I'm a psychologist. I used to see patients until I found my love for transportation, and I changed my career trajectory so I could focus on this industry. In fact, if you ask many people, they didn't set out for a career in transportation at all, but they find themselves in this area. There are jobs from the front line all the way to the C-suite. So for our students who are joining us, these comments are particularly towards you. There's exciting jobs that are available right here, right now. We'd love to talk with you about those jobs and opportunities further. With our technology transfer program, this is one of such events. We host about 31 of these events throughout the year where it's about a hot topic. It could be about transportation finance, about security, anything that's really pertinent to what's happening in current events or to highlighting research that we've completed. We reach about 6,000 professionals a year doing such activities, and it's very, very important because this is also an avenue for making sure that the findings of our research projects the results get into the hands of users responsible for implementing change. We're all here because we want to protect ourselves for the next big event and learn the best practices. And it's this kind of information exchange that's important to your university transportation center. Now, beyond that, I could go on and on. My two favorite topics are MTI and my daughter Charlie, but I do see I'm ending the time that I'm allotted here today. But I encourage you to find me during breaks or even after during the reception, so I can tell you more about our exciting opportunities. Before I introduce Dr. Edwards, I would also like to say that MTI maintains the world's largest database, let me underscore that, the world's largest database on terrorist activity against surface transportation targets. It's funded by the Department of Homeland Security. It's closed to the general public, rightfully so, but the information is used to publish different research perspectives and best practices for our transit agency partners. We also, within our Allied Telesis National Transportation Security Center, we do our emergency management work, our anti-terrorism work, and we are beginning in cybersecurity. Because what we know with positive train control and with the day-to-day employee, we're always at risk. So we need to make sure we manage that risk for the safety of our public and for the riders of the transportation system as a whole. So without further ado, I'd like to draw your attention to your program. There are bios for each of your speakers today. We have a lot of rich content to go through, so I'm not going to read the bios word for word, but I would like to say it is my distinct privilege and honor to introduce Dr. Frances Edwards. She's the Deputy Director of our Allied Telesis National Transportation Security Center. She is a professor here at San Jose State University, and she's the Director of the Master of Public Administration program. But perhaps most importantly for the topic at hand, for 22 years, Dr. Edwards was a public administration and emergency management practitioner. And for 14 years, she served as the Director of Emergency Preparedness for San Jose. She's a certified emergency manager. She's got almost every acronym that matters after her name, and I'd like to turn it over to her so she can officially call our session to order. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Philbrick, for that very generous introduction. It's my pleasure to be here today because this is the day after the official anniversary of an event that changed a lot of our lives. I was working at the city of Irvine when this event occurred, and I watched it on television instead of the World Series that I was expecting to see. And within 18 months, I was living and working here with the city of San Jose because the Loma Prieta event caused the executive leadership of the city to decide that they needed a more robust program. And I was happy to be able to be part of that. I want to acknowledge that today there's a number of members of our radio amateurs and civil emergency services here. You guys want to raise your hands up here? And RACES is a critical part of our emergency response capabilities right up to this day. So if you're looking for a really fun hobby and a way to meet a lot of very interesting people, I would encourage you to join San Jose RACES. They meet on the third Wednesday night of every month, and they're happy to have new members. So I have to give now the safety message. So please, I don't know if you noticed when you came in, you may have come up the elevator, but the exit from this building, if we should have to evacuate, is by going the rest of the way down this hallway to your left, and there's a big exit staircase that's clearly marked. Please do not go back and use the elevator if we have to evacuate. Also, you may have discovered already for yourself, but the restrooms are down this way in the hallway, men's and ladies' rooms on each side of the elevators. And we have, as you, I hope, found out, drinks and snacks available. Please feel free to get up and move around during the presentation to refresh yourselves as you wish. I want to thank all of you for coming today and being part of this event, which means a lot to me on another level because I was a member of the State of California's Seismic Safety Commission. And after the Loma Prieta earthquake, the commission produced this book. I think I have the last surviving hard copy of it, but I've always kept it because it was their vision for how we could become safer. It was their call to action for what the state of California needed to do to make all of us safer living in earthquake country. And some of the things that they suggested have been done. We have a strong motion instrumentation program where seismometers that are put on a lot of public buildings help us to better understand earthquakes when they occur, measure the shaking, and help seismologists study what these earthquakes mean. But they also had other ideas about improving our communication systems, about having more strict building codes and building code enforcement, about changing the way that we build structures, especially transportation-related structures. There's over 100 recommendations in this book. And as we came closer to the 30th anniversary last summer, I thought, boy, I wonder how many of those things we've actually accomplished. How many of those 100 visionary statements actually have come to fruition? And the answer is about 20. So I guess a 20% success rate is pretty good. And of course, we're still working on a number of them. But yesterday, we just had the 20th of the ones I counted, which was the implementation of the new earthquake early warning system here in the Bay Area that's now going to have an app that the general public can use. So up until yesterday, it was a pilot program being used by many scientists and other specialists who were determining whether the system was working. And they've now decided that it's working well enough to give it to everyone. So our 20th achievement out of over 100, but we're working forward. After the professional community had had a chance to think more about the earthquake, the National Academy of Sciences co-sponsored with the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute in Oakland another event, and I have the book for that here. And there were some more ideas that came to the fore. So I'll have these books around today. You're welcome to look at them. They're historic treasures from my perspective, but they're also guides for the future as we think about what more can we do to become better prepared and safe. So on your tables, you should all see some Post-it notes in different bright colors. I have some extras. If there aren't enough on your table, as I go back to my seat, I'll be happy to give you more. Just wave your hand. What we would like you to do is, as today unfolds, and you hear what people are reporting on what's been done, or what we recognize needs to be done, we'd like your ideas. So please just put one idea on a posted sheet. We've got some posters in the back. You may have noticed them when you went to get your drink. And we would encourage you to put your ideas on one of our posters and help us to begin to be visionaries for the future for the next 30 years. Because as Dr. Wein will tell you in just a few minutes, it's not a question of whether we're going to have an earthquake. It's a question of, is it going to be today or tomorrow or next week or in the next year? And so we need to be getting ready, and we need to be doing a better job of preparing our communities and our infrastructure to be functional. I think the public safety power shutoff event that we all lived through was a good reminder and a terrible reminder of what happens in an earthquake. Losing power is just one of many infrastructure changes that will occur. And when we think of how stunned people were that they were going to have to figure out how to be without power for 2 days, imagine how they're going to feel when they realize that it's going to be weeks before power is restored for most people and months for some people. So we heard a lot about the struggles of the folks in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria when they were without power. Those same things are going to happen to us if we don't think ahead and prepare. So there was an article that came out in the San Francisco Chronicle earlier this week. The headline is, "Earthquakes Still Surprise Us Even with All the Science." And yes, earthquakes still surprise us, and fortunately or unfortunately, they're going to continue surprising us, because the earthquake early warning system, which Dr. Wein's going to mention and Mr. Goodrich is going to talk about a bit, are not long-term predictions. They're based on the 2 waves that earthquakes emit, the P wave and the S wave. The P wave travels at 1.5 times the S wave, and that differential in time is the warning that we get. So it will allow us to duck and cover. It will allow automated systems to shut off hazardous materials pipelines and open fire department garage doors. But you have to get ready today. You can't wait for the prediction, because it will be way too late. So some of my students, who I want to acknowledge, thank you for coming. When we talk about Loma Prieta in class, give me blank looks. And I asked one of my classes, where were you when Loma Prieta happened? And one person said 6th grade. Another one said kindergarten. And then I had a lot of them that had really blank looks on their faces, and I said, well, where were you? And she said, I wasn't born yet. So in the spirit of not knowing for sure what your experience may have been, some of us were not living here at the time, some of us may not have even been in the country at the time, I thought I would do a very, very quick summary of the things that happened. And I'm not going to read these slides to you, but I just wanted to show you some information about when it happened, the magnitude, the epicenter. A lot of people don't realize the epicenter was way south of where the visual damage that was on the TV occurred. It was down at Peak Loma, Prieta, which is in the Santa Cruz Mountains, not too far from the city of Santa Cruz. And these are some of the kinds of events that occurred at that moment. Giant damage to our infrastructure. Not only our roads, this is Highway 17, I'm sure many of you have ridden on Highway 17 to the coast. It just rolled up. And also damage on our ports in Oakland. And Oakland is the largest container port in the northern half of the United States, northwest half of the United States. Los Angeles is the largest in the country, but Oakland is the largest one that ships food. So majority of our food exports go out of Oakland, and it was closed. Of course, iconic building damage, but these pictures are not the places that you heard about on the news. These are Los Gatos, Watsonville, and Santa Cruz, places that were fairly close to the epicenter and all had very significant damage. And yet the news media didn't cover these, first of all, because they were all at the game. So because they were there, that's what they covered. And of course, what I'll show you in a few minutes, the bridge and the superstructure were quite visual and stunning. But for these communities that are all fairly small towns, the loss of their downtown, the loss of their unreinforced masonry buildings was quite dramatic. And as I was mentioning to my Races colleagues just before we started, the only way we knew that there was damage in Los Gatos was because a ham, who was just a resident, not even a member of an organized group, but a ham hobbyist, a radio hobbyist, realized that he didn't have any way to communicate except his radio. So he thought, well, maybe other people can't tell people we are having trouble either. And it was his call onto the ham radio network that alerted the sheriff and ultimately the rest of the operational area that Los Gatos was in grave trouble. Their beautiful downtown with all their historic buildings had the masonry falling off. So those are just a few pictures. The one from Santa Cruz is the Garden Mall. And for people who grew up in the Bay Area, that was an iconic place where they used to have a lot of social action activities. And when it collapsed, many people felt as though they'd lost their second home. And these are the more famous events because they happened in San Francisco near where the game was supposed to have occurred. And so at the top you see the cypress structure. It was a 2-story freeway. The top collapsed onto the bottom. 42 people were killed in that one location, that one single failure. And that is the vast majority, 63 people total, died, and more than 2/3 of them died in that one spot. So you can see that having good infrastructure matters. The Bay Bridge collapse resulted in 1 death, and it resulted in us getting a whole new bridge because this one can't be fixed. The old one was built on bad soil, and it wasn't realized until this earthquake occurred. And then here, we have just one example of the many buildings that had damage in San Francisco. We also had, in addition to the 63 deaths, we had 3,757 injuries, of which 350 were considered very severe. So the built environment was damaged. We had 24,000 residential facilities that were damaged or destroyed, 3,500 commercial, and 140 public agency sites. So if you say, well, when we have an earthquake, I'll just call 911 and get a fireman. Not going to happen. Because the firemen are going to be going to people who are in collapsed buildings. And they're going to be dealing with hazardous materials, accidents, and conflagrations, which individuals cannot cope with. So you and your neighbors need to work together to be prepared, to help each other, because the public agencies are victims along with the rest of the community. Unreinforced masonry buildings failed in large numbers, resulted in 8 deaths. 50 of those buildings were ultimately determined to be beyond repair, and 350 were severe. We had 147 here in San Jose, and the city took the initiative to create a program so that within 5 years, they were all either retrofitted, repurposed, or taken down. But we haven't been that fortunate in the rest of the Bay Area, and we still have a lot of URMs in use today. Other kinds of structural damage you can see on the slides. So while I could absolutely go on and on for hours, it's a chance now for me to introduce our colleague who's come to us from USGS, Dr. Wein. And I am a Luddite, as most of you know. So it's going to take me just a second to get her slideshow up. So let me pause, but here comes Ann to the podium. So let's welcome Dr. Wein.
We've got some overlap. So hopefully you know that USGS is a credible source of earthquake information, and it's had a few things to say lately in the Bay Area around some earthquakes up in Pleasant Hill, 4.7, and once again there was an earthquake on an unmapped fault, and which is a good thing because it means there's not going to be a big earthquake. So in our study, we've studied the Hayward fault, and hopefully by studying it means that it won't happen there, because it always seems to be that if you focus on one particular fault, the earthquake happens somewhere else. So my job at USGS is mostly about translating the science. So we have a lot of science, and we have very few people of us who try to work with us to help you all understand what it could mean and retell the story in today's terms. So today I'm going to do a look back at Loma very quickly, because we've already had a good one. And then what about if the earthquake happened today on the Hayward fault? That's our Hayward scenario. And then just looking forward, just a brief comment there, because hopefully you guys are the ones with all those good ideas. So you've heard some of this, but what I will show you is the shake map of the Loma earthquake, and it was very interesting for scientists because we hadn't fully understood the variability of the shaking. So often the idea was the closer to the fault, the more shaking that you have, and you can see there that that's not the case. We've got red splotches all over the place. And if you can see far enough into San Francisco and Oakland, where Franny was pointing out those disastrous set of damages, the colour has intensified, and that's because of the soil condition at that time. So at Loma Prieta, we did not know how to model ground motion with soil conditions sort of as part of the picture. So now we have a lot better understanding of how seismic waves can travel and shape. However, the engineers will say that the Loma Prieta was not a rigorous test, partly because it was quite far away from the urban area. But they say it was important to find the vulnerabilities at the time, although we relearned some of the vulnerabilities, which were the unenforced reinforced masonry, because there was already a law in place in California a few years before Loma Prieta earthquake that was trying to get attention to the risk in those buildings. So you might have seen some of these pictures already. The three kinds of buildings were the URMs, reinforced masonry, the bricks. The soft story, the one there in the middle, often it's a garage on the bottom. Very small soft story is also crippled wall, which my house has, which we need to, so an earthquake will find the vulnerability in your building. So if you've got one soft story, that will go. And also non-ductile concrete buildings had problems. It also showed an issue with historic buildings, and the need to think about those ahead of time, because there are big fights over historic buildings always, and the same in Christchurch, just in the earthquakes there recently in New Zealand. Without thinking ahead, It's gonna be very rough time with historic buildings, and Santa Cruz lost its Cooper building there, that's the one in the middle. But the engineers would say that it was really a lifeline disaster, lifeline infrastructure disaster. And one of them mapped out, so you can sort of see the whole extent of where all kinds of lifelines had problems in big ways during that earthquake. And then there's the whole red area where there's a whole bunch of stuff up there in San Francisco and Oakland, so far from the epicenter, that had major problems and caused most of the deaths. I referred to the National Research Council just to say, okay, well, what have we done since then? And we've done some good things. So progress on the URM law has been made, but I believe it's about an 80% rate of success. So like Franny said, they're still around. On the science side, there was to be seismic zoning maps and design maps for buildings. So the building code got a big boost after Loma Prieta. So anything built after that is much better off than buildings before. And the idea too was to have the real-time shake map. So that shake map I showed you of the Loma Prieta earthquake did not come out at that time. That's scientists going back and making one after the fact. A lot of mapping of liquefaction, landslide potential, and fault mapping, especially within CGS and zonation. Bridges and building, there's been research on performance. There's been the idea of performance-based seismic engineering, so not just about saving lives, but also saving function of these structures. And a lot of research on retrofitting and training, and we don't have enough construction workers right now to meet all the needs. And finally, building rating systems. So there's been about 3 efforts to be able to communicate to building owners to understand the risks in their buildings. So that's a lot of good news. And in the numbers, we can see a lot. One of my colleagues at USGS went round and tried to add up all the seismic investments that have been made in the Bay Area since Loma Prieta earthquake, and he got up to about $80 billion, which is pretty impressive that we are an area that invests in seismic development, retrofitting and rebuilds. So most of that, of course, is in transportation. The bridges sucked up a lot of that money, followed by hospitals. You can see URMs, you can see it there. Water, power station, there was a power station failure during Loma Prieta. But it's also interesting to look to see where that money has been spent. And San Francisco is the star, but San Francisco is not where the population is, and not where, on average, the oldest buildings are. So San Francisco is definitely a leader, and they've got a lot of work to do still with their soft story. But the other counties have not, according to what we can find, have not had the same amount of investment, and they do have a lot more risk still. So which makes the Hayward fault, again, a very interesting case to think about. So that's what we did. We have created this scenario called Hayward. Hayward fault, going haywire, haywired. Wired, wireless world, connectiveness, collaboration to solve problems is kind of what we're trying to do here. And in the scenario are all the scientific advances that have been made since the Loma Prieta earthquake. So in some ways we will be relearning because we still have the same risks. And the idea is to also tell a story. We have to keep telling the story. So why the Hayward fault? Not within since Loma Prieta earthquake, there have been trenches dug. And at this site, near the Fremont BART station, there are 12 earthquakes in 1,800 years, which means, on average, 150 years the Hayward fault has been rupturing. And you can do the math, but the last one was 1986. And it was called the Great Earthquake. And this picture here is the courthouse, the county courthouse and jail. And the story there is that unfortunately one clerk was killed by the building collapsing. And there was a bunch of prisoners in the jailhouses underneath. And the residents heard them screaming for help or praying to God because they were stuck in their jail houses and locked in. But fortunately the keys were found and they were able to be taken out and transported. So all of this kind of scientific information of how often the Hayward fault has ruptured, etc., has been put into this product by the USGS called the probability of a large earthquake in the Bay Area in the next 30 years. And that probability is 72% on average, but there's uncertainty between like 30-something% and 94%. So just so you know, that's about as best as we can do with the science. And you'll notice that if you load the probabilities on the faults, the Hayward fault it wins with a 30-something% chance. So it's the most likely fault to rupture, but this is geologic time and versus our lifetime, so anything can happen, anytime, anywhere. So don't feel like, good, I'm on the other side of the peninsula, it's more likely the Hayward fault, because that's always a mistake. So I'm going to show you that we can now, is that working? Oh, it didn't work. Oh no. Hang on. We practiced this. Let me go back and see if I can. I'll try again.
Don't worry, a millennial's coming.
Yeah. Alright, I'm going to show you a simulation of our scenario. So it's a Hayward fault rupture, magnitude 7, epicenter in Oakland, which means it's going to be bilateral. So and it's going to, it goes slightly, puts more energy into the south. Whoopsie, not necessarily. Well, that looks hopeful. Alright, so you can look out for the rupture coming from Oakland, and it's coming to you in San Jose, and the ground shaking is exaggerated for effect, so don't be totally freaked out by how much the ground is shaking and how, but the length of the shaking, oh, did it go?
Well, it's up, but
Oh, there we go. Alright, now you can see it. Alright, so you can see how it ruptures along the fault and it comes to us in San Jose here. It's going to wobble around a long time because it's a basin in San Jose, and their shaking will get amplified here. So if you were here, you could feel shaking for about 30 seconds. That would feel like forever. It is also strong enough shaking where you won't be able to stand up. So that's the idea of drop, cover, hold on, drop, at least get down so you don't get thrown down. And of course, any poorly built buildings are going to be damaged, and even some better built buildings would be in the red areas. And you can see how it's just wobbling around like jelly there. So not the strongest shaking here, but perhaps the longest, some of the longest shaking. Alright, so what just happened? The fault ruptured, and as it ruptured, it also shifted. So we had some offset of up to 2 meters in some places. So that means roads, fiber optic cables, water pipelines are all, oh, is it right? Oh, okay, good. Oh, I see. So for this scenario, here's a possibility of how much the fault would rupture at the surface. And there's an example up there of what it could look like. And down the bottom is a photo of a tour that we had on the Hayward fault just a few weekends ago. And we are literally straddling the fault right there. You can see it expressed in the parking lot in Hayward fault. And it moves 10 millimeters a year, I think, because it's 40 millimeters for the whole Bay Area, and 25% of the movement is on the Hayward fault. So it's always moving, and we're always having to patch it up. However, that's not all. Oh. Hey! That looks like New Zealand.
oh, that's great. It's still there.
how much was the movement that you just mentioned?
How much is up to 2 meters. So here, up to 2 meters. This is what this fence is showing. This is just one scenario. Now, where it's not, where it's not filled in, where you didn't see any offset at the surface. Because the Hayward fault is a creeping fault, always moving along, and if you go to Hayward, you'll see one building has actually moved past another. After an earthquake, we don't expect a clean break. It will keep slipping. And it could slip up to another 1.5 meters over time. So that means infrastructure, they've got a real challenge in deciding how they're going to repair and replace anything that's causing the fault. We saw a little bit of this in the Napa earthquake recently, but it was in inches rather than feet of displacement. And we're still running on the beach.
Get just the single slide back.
Well, that's okay. So then people can see what's coming.
Yeah.
All right.
So go to slideshow view.
Right, now you can see that liquefaction is coming up, and there's 2 photos there from the Loma earthquake, and they're in the Marina district. The one at the top is showing the gas lines and pipelines were broken, and the bottom one is showing the unfortunate situation of having a poorly built building on poor soil. So for the scenario, since Loma Prieta, since all the soils have now been mapped, we can try and say, so for liquefaction you need 3 things. You need to have poor soil, you need to have a water table that's fairly shallow, and then you need to shake it. So what we did is we put the shaking that you just saw in that animation into some models of liquefaction probability to show where the problems would be, which are not surprising in the places where we have artificial fill and along streams. Same thing with landslides. California Geological Survey made these maps, and they tried to use information from the Loma Prieta earthquake to also understand where landslides might initiate, where they're more likely to initiate in our scenario. Something else that's new with this scenario that was really inspired by the New Zealand earthquake sequence, and I grew up in Christchurch actually, which is where those earthquakes occurred, was all the aftershocks and what that does to us as people and communities and buildings. So we have added that into the scenario here, and we selected one. Is it going? Oh yeah. Sequence, and we have about 16 aftershocks, and they end up coming into Silicon Valley, some big ones there it is. And we chose that, we generated thousands of possibilities, but we chose the one which has about a 1 in 20 chance of coming into Santa Clara, just so we could involve more of the Santa Clara County and the peninsula. What you'll notice is the typical behavior of aftershocks is a lot all at once at the beginning, and then as time goes over they slow down. But if you get another bigger one, it'll then re-energize the sequence and you get a whole bunch more. So USGS now has an aftershock forecast that tries to help you understand where we are in the sequence and what the statistics are likely to be in terms of your probability of having another big one, or how many you expect to feel. Maybe you expect to feel 100 in the next week. It's possible. It's good for people to know that that's normal. And certainly in Christchurch, with all their aftershocks, people were very relieved to know that it was normal. It's important psychologically. All right, and we talked about Shake Alert that was released yesterday on an app called My Shake, and we tried to figure out how it would perform for our scenario. And you see a hole in the middle. Now that's the time between when the time for the shaking to reach a location. We can't beat it with a telecommunications or radio transmission. So there's always a hole in the middle, but once we get beyond that, you can see approximately how many seconds of warning you might get to make yourself safe. Now, if you take that bullseye picture and put it down by Santa Cruz, if we'd had it then, you would see that San Francisco and Oakland, which really had a lot of problems, would actually have 10 or so seconds of warning. So that's what we're hoping for. It's your last chance to do something to save your life or save your process. So to build our scenario, we take all that science, bottom floor of our building, and then we build up from there and say, what does this mean in terms of our engineered structures? And then finally, what does this mean for our communities? And I'm only going to pick and choose a few things here today based on the theme of this meeting being transportation and telecommunications, but just to give you a look, building damage, just to give you the footprint. Of course, it's very intense in Alameda County near the fault. It's more than the Loma and Prieta earthquake in terms of how much damage there would be. And of course, insurance will cover very little of it because we're not insured. There are still vulnerable buildings around, and if we look at sort of precast concrete type buildings or URMs, then we can pick out certain parts where they will be problematic. And if not hit by the main shock, then you have to worry about them in the aftershocks. And the picture down there shows the difference between retrofitting a URM and not. So the left is not retrofitted, but the one next to it was. So it does work. Now we worked with BART and Caltrans on what the transportation system may do in terms of its performance and its bridges. So the top one is an estimate of sort of how long it might take, up to 4 to 10 months for some of the highway bridges. And then BART has a much more severe story of up to 1 to 3 years for some of their stations. The stations are built for life safety, but they won't work well, and will have to be rebuilt. And bus bridges would have to be connecting them, but it won't be easy to have bus bridges when the roads are also congested. So it's a very difficult story here because you're looking problems north and south and east and west. Whereas in the Loma Prieta earthquake, no one wanted to cross a bridge. In this case, it may be your best way to go because you've got to get through a whole bunch of landslides and fault crossings in this scenario. And you can see the other times there, approximate times from working with the different utilities and expertise on to try to ballpark how that may play out. And then San Jose Airport is likely to perform better than Oakland and San Francisco, but we still see liquefaction, high probability sort of under the terminal side, and we see sort of some high shaking and some moderate liquefaction possibility on the other side. And I've heard Jim Walbrink from San Jose Water pick out problems with water pipes in that area right near the airport. We're trying to go a step further and think about co-located infrastructure. Often one infrastructure damages another, or when they go to repair one, they then damage another. It's unbelievably uncommon. So since we're here about transportation and telecommunications, I'm showing you the example of fiber optic cables on bridges in the Bay Area, and in particular fiber optic cables that are on bridges that are assigned to be very heavily impacted in this scenario. And it's a quite high ratio on these bridges. Caltrans doesn't really know what's on its bridges, so we have to do GIS to try and figure this out. But as recently as an earthquake in 2018 in Japan, they saw the situation where the bridge abutment shifted and the cable was broken. So those interactions are also something to think about. Like never before, we have tried to really dig into telecommunications infrastructure, and David Witkowski is here somewhere. There he is, and he is my savior on this because it's never really been done before. We've held a couple of workshops, and we've got data from Geotel, best as they understand where central offices are, where data centers are, where the fibre optics are running, whether they're inter-office or long haul, and where the cellular towers are, and whether they're freestanding or monopoles or if they're on buildings. So some of the key points. We don't really know about central offices. We know there've been some mention of retrofit, but there's not really any regulations. So it's very hard to know how central offices may perform. Data centers have an advantage of being more regulated, and there's actual evidence of design of those centers. But in our scenario, they're more exposed to liquefaction and aftershocks in the central offices. We have hundreds of freestanding towers. Working with the Telecommunications Industry Association, they do not find that the shaking from the earthquake exceeds the standards for building for wind. So they appear to be in pretty good shape. Monopoles could be a problem if they've got too much on them. So we kind of got close to the line there. But most of our sites are on buildings. And who knows what this building code or standards of those buildings are. We have 5,000 at least sites on buildings. So we think that's something to really think about that's different about this urban environment for this earthquake. Any unanchored equipment, of course, is always going to be a problem. The industry feels they don't really understand ground movement very well. So we looked at shaking, but they don't feel they have a good grasp of liquefaction in particular. So there's not really any standards on how you should be laying lines through liquefiable areas. We couldn't find anything for fibre optic cables crossing fault lines and that sort of thing. So there's definitely room for improvement. Fire after earthquake is a problem for aerial infrastructure, but also, as we saw in the fires in North County, the heat could get in through the bolts and still melted cables. Also in our scenario, the 911 centres are not showing, we have quite a few that showed up as only really partially functional. So what we did here was we tried to think, how can we show people whether they'll be able to make a phone call or access information or not? So there's a whole bunch of aspects that feed in. One is the damage. So we kind of took the damage and exposure and decided how much capacity we had lost, and also working with industry expertise on opinion around how much network capacity might be lost. Then we said, well, if you're depending on power, we put that into our model. And then we allowed ourselves later to put in backup power and response of cars and colts and that sort of thing. And then we also imposed the user demand. And we used data from other earthquakes and other events to try and parameterize this model. So you can see, the blue line is the power line for Alameda County. Power dependence, of course, is going to really interfere with any ability for services. But eventually, backup power helps for a little bit, but then it can fizzle out after a few days. But once you get the cars and colts coming in, it could take a few days to get the trucks in, then you're really on your path to recovery, and you could exceed the power restoration, which means you could have communications and not power. So that's why it's worth thinking about the backup power for your telecom. You'll see also that often these figures are drawn to show just the capacity, and you'll see that, say from here, you'll see like at first we have a lot of capacity, and then the backup power batteries run out and it goes down and back up. Well, in this case, because we put in the increase of demand, people using the systems, it just pulls the whole thing down. And the amount of service here is comparable to what was recorded after 9/11 in New York, after the World Trade Center. So we're kind of telling a feasible story here. I'm not going to talk a lot about water distribution. That was all modeled and how long it will take, up to 6 months, but one piece we didn't factor in, or no one has yet, is what's the dependence on water for cooling in the Bay Area? We don't know. Now I'll bring to your attention fire ignitions, and this is a great example of just everything going wrong. So first of all, your building's not built properly, or your structures are not built strongly, and you start a fire. Then you try to report it, but you can't because you can't get through because telecommunications are congested. Then you look for a fire truck. You may not have one because they've already gone off to the other fires. Maybe you've got a fire truck, then you've got to get through the roads and get to your place. Suppose you arrive, then you need water, and you just saw all the problems with water. So fire following earthquake is still a real threat in the Bay Area. It was a big deal, of course, after 1906, and it was also a problem after Loma Prieta earthquake. Another series of work we've done is community at risk. I'm just going to make one point, but if you look at where all the concentrated damages in our scenario, yellow and pink, and you think about how many people could be displaced in those areas, you've got hundreds of thousands of people. And if you then look at the vulnerability of those communities in those places, because they often go together, like almost half of that population is what we would call a more vulnerable population, compared to a presence of about 22% in the whole Bay Area. And these people, back to your theme, tend to be very reliant on cellular service, so they're going to be trying to move, they'll be being displaced. So there's a real vulnerability there for those folks. One last point I pulled out on our economic analysis is transportation. And this analysis is just looking at losses of output losses, and the blue is from the property damage. So a lot of business activity cannot happen because of the property damage. But suppose you think about how people move around the Bay Area and commute, and whether they can get through those maps of BART and Caltrans that I showed you earlier, then you get the red output losses, and it's less in the East Bay, but you'll see that becomes a pain for the West Bay and the South Bay because of the way people are moving between their jobs. When all this is put into the economic model, transportation disruption, assuming some telecommuting potential, which now has implications for telecommunications industry to be able to provide that, adds about another 50% of economic losses, as in gross regional product, or as in how many jobs are lost, and that sort of thing. So last slide, back to our wired scenario. The thought really is where things are trying to move are integrated lives, integrated actions. So we're trying to move from buildings, not just make them life safe, but think about how the community uses them and how they need them in terms of how they should be built to be able to function afterwards. Think about all the interactions and our hazards. We are now able to understand how shaking, liquefaction, landslide, aftershocks, afterslip all happen, and fire following earthquake. Lifelines, how they interact with each other, I gave an example. And then the economy, of course, there's ripple effects through the economy around all of this. It also points to, again, community and neighbourhood mitigation and preparedness, and just the Frannials who made this point. Personally, I have a cripple wall building, and a building with cripple wall. It has an old retrofit from after Loma Prieta earthquake, and I'll have to redo it because it's not now like how they've tested retrofits to work. On the interactions from this study, I have invested in a solar-powered generator and battery so that I can have my communications. And as a community, I trained as a CERT. I now have a radio to radio out to my neighbourhood, and I can radio to the city EOC. So this scenario has been a journey for me as well. Finally, integrating earthquakes into the regional plan, that's been one of our successes. The futures by Metropolitan Transportation Committee and ABAG put our scenario into their three different futures, and we won a Metro award for providing the work for that. So hopefully we're becoming more integrated in our lives and our actions. Thank you. So
I'm sure some of you would like to ask Dr. Wein some questions. We have 10 minutes for you to do that, so please, let's start here.
When you were talking about infrastructure, one of the other things that went through my mind were dams. There's the Lexington, Anderson, and I think the Calaveras. What risk do they present? And the thing that also goes through my mind is seasonal, the wintertime when we're getting a lot of rain. Do earthquakes tend to occur more frequently then? And combining those hazards, is it create a worst case situation?
Actually, great. Those are two great questions. On dams, we wanted to, but we didn't. But I spoke to East Bay Mud, and they assure me that they're on top of their dams. I can't speak to the others. Great question on the water. That's why the earthquake was hit in April, because the hillsides would be more saturated, and that affects landslides.
Given a certain fault line, it appears that the earthquake is stronger in certain areas along the fault line. How is
Great question.
that?
So it depends how much it slips at that place. So the slip, when it ruptures, it doesn't rupture equally all the way along. And some parts have, like the bigger offset, they send out more energy.
Is that likely to change with time then? Where this?
Some of it can change, because it depends how it's been moving over time, yeah. The bit that won't change is how it interacts with the type of soil. So you saw shaking over in the Tri-City area, right? It's picking up basin effects there. So those things won't change. Yeah. Yeah.
So very, very informative, and just a couple of things to add in maybe for future research questions, kind of questions that I have sitting in the seat that I do in emergency operations center and beyond. So with the telco stuff, and David is a good expert on this, I think one of the things, two patterns we see which will make your graph even worse. One is we move from small cell to small cells, and we move to putting those technology on the actual light poles. The question of power becomes even more paramount, and the vulnerability of that infrastructure becomes even more interesting and more complex.
I
Right?
forgot to mention that.
And then second, you take numbers from 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 3 years ago on usage, you're going to be orders of magnitude off. And what we have seen is that first thing that people do is they pick up their phones. First thing they do is start streaming something live. The bandwidth punch that we're going to get on these during these disasters is through the roof. And that's the whole reason for FirstNet and Band 14 and having a dedicated emergency service line is augmented. That need is augmented because of the fact that the civilian system will be completely overwhelmed. And so I'm sure you're thinking about all that, but I would be very curious about those as kind of next level research questions on telcos, because that's anecdotally what we're beginning to see, and even in this power shutoff, some interesting stuff. Second one is around soft story, which we're moving toward finally, mandatory retrofit on in San Jose, slowly but surely. And one of the things I'd be interested in again, additional research on is my hypothesis is that if you look at, for example, soft story, in San Jose, much of the form of those soft stories are 60s apartment buildings, right, with a garage underneath and 4 or 5 stories. They also often are not coincidentally the most affordable. And so part of the assessment that is, I'd like to see more attention paid to, and you've seen some in the shakeout maps, is impact is relative. And if I'll pick on my own community, a well-financed homeowner in Willow Glen is an impact, but it's not one that I'm going to have to worry about or mitigate compared to an apartment building with people leaving 3 families to a floor who are already on the edge of the edge. And so I think that as you think about these scenarios, especially these large shakes, helping us in the government understand sort of where those vulnerable impacts are going to be in a way that we can then really prepare both our planning investments and then our response in mass care and sheltering more effectively. It's super helpful.
Yeah, so I do have a chapter for you, and I only showed one slide from it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I love the work.
Actually, it's sort of in that direction of like low-income communities that are going to be the most vulnerable, who are going to be utilizing the cellular devices. If they use the ShakeUp app or Shake app, will that's going to offset their the regular network, so you'll be able to get notifications. It'll be on a different telecommunication basically.
Well, you should, well, not all of it, but you should get it before the damage hits you. The idea is you get 10 seconds of warning on your phone, so hopefully it gets to you before it takes out any communications that might affect your phone.
So it's not a guarantee that you'll
Well,
you'll get the notification, but then it's just, that's it.
It's all the system's quite hardened from what I understand when I ask those questions, but getting it down to us, where we are,
And what makes the low-income population more vulnerable than those who are not in?
it's the buildings they're living in, just like we had explained over there.
So
A lot of them are all multi-family buildings.
So like low-income,
Yeah, that's the affordable housing, and it's old construction, and it hasn't been retrofitted, and there's a big, sure San Jose man here can explain all that, but you've gotta pay for it. And how do you pass the cost through to the renters, and if you have passing too much cost, then you displace them because they can't live there anymore. It's a very delicate balance that Hayward, the city of Hayward is dealing with at the moment. Not my self-story.
Maybe one more question before our break?
Yep.
I had a kind of similar question about the demographic impact. So one thing that I was thinking about, just bringing it back to San Jose State, being a San Jose State student here, it's very easy to picture people being kind of stranded downtown if they rely on public transportation and things like that aren't available. How do you see students like that who rely on public transportation being affected in another big quake like this?
I think it's a great question, and it really concerns me a lot. Of all of this work is the vulnerable population. And what I've done is I've hooked up with the anthropology department here at San Jose, and they're going to help me get from my maps of vulnerable populations and damage to hopefully that next level of understanding.
Well, I know we would all like to talk with Ann for the rest of the time, but we have some other presenters that I think will also be interesting for you. But let's thank Dr. Wein for her work. So we're now going to have a 20-minute break. So please be back in your chairs by 2:35 so that we can begin our next presentations.
Yeah, we're.
That was going to take a while.
So the way that we're approaching it,
Is it okay, Doc? Yeah,
moving forward.
Yes.
So it's the other fries.
Moving forward, focus on.
I have two questions.